Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we read the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers, he is the editor of independent news site livenews.co.nz, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning. And he is the Associate Professor at the School of Communication Studies at AUT Media Oracle, Dr. Wayne Hope. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, it's a budget special. What are the social, economic and political ramifications of today's Zero Budget? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with our first focus tonight. What are the social implications and ramifications of today's Zero Budget? Selwyn, for the 267,000 New Zealanders who are unemployed and underemployed, does today's Zero Budget amount to a life sentence?
Oh, it certainly amounts to something that gives signals of zero hope in this whole delivery here. I think we could see the writing on the wall, particularly in the lead up to the last election. The public who were voting, many of them obviously decided they wanted to put the blinkers on, didn't want to hear certain messages. Throughout the last 3 months, while the government has been on the back foot in disarray in many respects, we have seen the rhetoric building up to exclude and outclass, if you like, that significant proportion of New Zealanders that you've identified there. What we would want in a budget at this stage is one which is obviously fiscally prudent. But we would also want one that was fair, and I do not see any fairness in the budget for these people in that group.
Do you think austerity is a good enough justification to just allow almost 250,000 New Zealanders to just be thrown on the
you can be austere, but I think you've got to actually prioritise, and it's about that. I haven't seen anything in this budget. There isn't anything in this budget to address the fiscal shortfall that developed because of the government entering in 2008 a taxation reduction regime for the most wealthy. We have not seen any move to balance and put a balance back into that imbalance in the New Zealand economy.
The 17% of young New Zealanders between 15 and 19 who are unemployed, what's in this for them?
You know, I would say what I would like, and Wayne can speak obviously strongly to these points, but what I would like to see in a budget like this is one that does not create a cul-de-sac policy like the government did back in 2008, where it caps numbers at a certain time when the proportion of New Zealanders in that age group is increasing. So where does the spill go? There isn't anything there as far as hope, except for perhaps skills training at a basic level that might give the person an opportunity to go and actually make a quid over the ditch in Australia.
It's a pretty terrible budget for young New Zealanders who are unemployed, isn't it? I mean, 16% of our workforce are young people, and they represent almost half of those who are unemployed.
You know, looking at the 1991 budget, the mother of all budgets, we all reeled from that and we thought, how on earth do you actually get ahead in these kind of circumstances? This one's like, what's that old saying about a death by 1,000 cuts?
Yeah.
This is like, moderation being redefined as miserable.
Right.
Yes, we all need to balance our books, but once again, get back to that point, it's prioritising.
Wayne, 50,000 New Zealanders left New Zealand for Australia this year. How does this budget bring any of them back?
Well, one of those 50,000 is my nephew. He's a skilled electrician.
Yep.
If he was looking at the budget today, I don't think he'd be booking a plane from Sydney Airport and coming straight back.
Yeah.
One of the key things here is there seems to be no investment in skilled labour.
Because it's all going overseas, isn't it? As soon as we train it, they leave.
Well, let me give you an example of something that could have been done but wasn't. We all know that there's a major housing crisis in Christchurch after the earthquake, and there's more and more people living in caravans, living in cars, can't afford the huge rents for private accommodation. So that would have been an opportunity surely for a major public investment program in low-cost housing, and perhaps you could build some apprenticeships around that, and perhaps that would help rebuild, the Technical Institute in Christchurch. In other words, kind of infrastructural development, a bit of local economic growth, and a bit of job creation all rolled into one. And that's what's sorely missing from this budget.
Right.
Because it's just something out of Charles Dickens. It's making a virtue out of austerity.
Right.
Uncle Bill is going to look after us, and this castor oil will taste nice, won't it? Won't it?
What do we need to do to start bringing New Zealanders home? What can we do to make them think of their home as a place they want to stay?
Well, I mean, the first thing is just what I've said. You invest in areas which are going to encourage skilled labour and tradesmen and things like that. I think maybe some support could be given to the living wage campaign.
Yes.
Because if you don't do that, then the big gap between the lower wage brackets in New Zealand and Australia will look even worse in the future. So you get more working class people going to Australia. So maybe if that was addressed, we might be able to staunch the flow of those kinds of people.
Yeah.
But to be realistic though, Bomber, in many respects, the Australian and New Zealand economy is pretty well integrated anyway.
Yes. Yes.
And it's perhaps a little misleading to see our two economies as utterly separate. But we could do a lot more to make the growth pole in New Zealand and the social structure in New Zealand a bit more livable.
Yeah, we can't really do a GC in any part of New Zealand, can we? It's not that beautiful. Selwyn, Treasury projecting 3.5% wage growth with a 5% unemployment. Is that just ludicrous?
Well, there'd have to be a major turnaround in what Wayne is talking about, an investment in the skills area and also opportunity to express those skills, to work on projects for that unemployment to go down to that. We've got to remember that the trends in unemployment have been creeping up well above the 6%. So, you know, there's nothing in this budget to actually make that turnaround. Also, you know, if you look at from the right point of view, you know, you look at the employers and manufacturers and the exporter groups here crowing in the New Zealand Herald this week saying, you know, it really needs some sort of economic stimulus to actually get, you know, its opportunity developing, which in turn would perhaps create jobs back in New Zealand. Now, there's nothing in the budget for that. What I do notice is that, you know, the forecast, for example, the February forecast, Treasury forecast said, what was it, $12.1 billion deficit, right? The budget forecast, so only months later, 3-4 months later, is saying $8.4 billion deficit. So it's reduced it down. And the government was arguing that the reduction in the anticipated forecast deficit there was due to, you know, the Christchurch rebuild being deferred.
That's right.
Now, is it an advantage for the government to do nothing here because it starts to actually put it out into the never-never?
Right.
You know, that the cost now is being deferred till later, and that is not looking after the needs of Christchurch.
Wayne,
people.
for students at uni and pupils at school, how's the zero budget impacting them? Higher classrooms and cutting off study for people doing their PhD in their 5th year. What's the impact here?
Well, that first point you mentioned about the increase in class sizes, I just noticed this afternoon that that's going to directly impact primary school level. Now that's cruel. It means that primary school teachers are going to have more difficulty dealing with handicapped students or
And
slow
they're doing
learners.
a tough job as it is at the moment, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's cruel. Well, as far as the changes to student loans are concerned, well, what that's going to do is it's going to discourage people from staying in New Zealand after they've got their undergraduate degree.
So we're giving an incentive for those who have got the skills to leave the country.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you saw those big sort of job search seminars that were held in, was it Green Lane?
Yep.
And just hundreds and hundreds of people,
Yeah.
and not just going down to have a look, but
Signing
going
up.
down and signing up.
Yeah.
There's nothing in this budget to prevent that. Just another point about the lack of job creation and the lack of incentive for people to stay here. You all know that the government's really hot on local bodies at the moment to get their debt down.
Yes.
Therefore you've got to sell off your assets. There's a dividend stream gone, hasn't it? And the government hates local bodies trying to create new forms of tax revenue for themselves. We'll knock that one on the head. And what that means is that local bodies can't take their own initiatives to create jobs and develop apprenticeships in provincial towns and bigger cities around New Zealand. So the government's actually acting against the creation of jobs and the keeping of people in New Zealand.
Just to pick up on that point too, that the government is moving to legislate to actually punish local government, you know, where the debt goes up, etc., etc. At the same time, where the government itself is saying that its anticipated overall indebtedness, remember that in the last 2 years in particular, its rate of borrowing of offshore funds has been just climbing like this. Up to $70 billion in maximum debt before it starts to trail off. That's why it's own admissions.
That's
These are
right.
significant issues here.
Final question, both of you. Who in society wins and loses in this budget? Who wins, who loses?
Well, I think we all lose apart from those very wealthy. And, if the government was sowing into the media environment this idea that, even the wealthy, those that look after National, are going to have to shoulder some of this
Yes.
burden, that's just rubbish. There
Yes.
isn't anything that actually stacks up in big dollar terms. In
Who
that
wins,
respect.
who loses, Wayne?
Well, if you look at this budget in the context of the tax cuts in 2010, where the top 10 or 15% of the population did extremely well and got extra money in their pay packets. Okay, middle people about the same, went up slightly, and the further down the scale you went, the more you lost. Then after that, we had the public service cuts, social services, legal services. Oh, you call an 0800 number now. The increase in craft slices. You add everything up, and what it just looks to me, it's just wealth defence. For those that are better off in New Zealand. It's just defending of those people's wealth.
It's a great term.
It's defending their turf
Yeah.
and putting the pressure on others, which means that austerity is unevenly experienced in this country.
Absolutely.
And the role of the budget is to obscure that uneven experience by dressing it up as lots of new initiatives. But it's really robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with Focus 2. What are the economic ramifications of today's zero budget? Selwyn, it was embarrassingly announced today, on the day of the budget, that exports dropped a staggering 17% from last year. How will privatising our assets counter that?
Oh, it won't. They already have demonstrated that the intention is that the money from those sales, irrespective of whether or not we like it or not, is going towards some of the extra spending in some of the social sectors that really, in large part, are the costs of ideological change. So, and the other thing too is the whole government's program here is based on a premise that commodity prices are going to withstand pressure overseas, that New Zealand's commodity prices are going to withstand that. Now that's questionable in the week where it was announced commodity prices globally have gone down.
That's right.
The other aspect is that while the government hammers away at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade's ability to sell New Zealand out offshore,
Yeah.
it's expecting New Zealand to be competitive against Chile, Argentina and these other commodity production countries that are similar to ours. It's not a good recipe here.
Wayne, Treasury's bewilderingly optimistic growth forecasts have been wrong 4 years in a row. These numbers were fixed in before the latest Greece, before Greece started its latest death spiral. Greece is going to get worse. Europe's going to get worse. We're going to be worse off. These figures aren't going to stand up, are they?
Absolutely not. We live in a complex global economy where there are thousands of variables to take into account. So who would expect a small treasury and a small country to come up with the right numbers? What's about to happen in the Eurozone is going to have a big impact on New Zealand. It looks as though Greece is going to leave the Euro, right? And if they manage to form a political coalition which are against the austerity packages, and let's just say there's a bit of a mess to start with, but they do tolerably well. The bankers won't like it, the bondholders won't like it, but then other countries like Spain are going to think, well, actually, maybe we would be better off leaving the euro, because Spain is really getting squeezed at the moment, youth unemployment over 50%. Now, once that starts to happen, then some banks will get into trouble. And when banks get into trouble, you get a liquidity crisis. And when you get a liquidity crisis, it's harder for banks in New Zealand to raise money offshore, and then that has recessionary impacts here in New Zealand. So I would have thought, given that that scenario is not unlikely, I would have thought that the government should be looking for more opportunities to raise revenue through new kinds of taxation, so they got something like a fund available.
Like a Cullen fund, like a specific,
not
a Cullen fund.
Don't want to get into party politics here.
But a fund to fight the Europe collapse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Selwyn, the top tax rate in New Zealand 25 years ago was 66 cents in the dollar. It's now 33 cents in the dollar. The richest have had their tax rate drop by 50% in quarter of a century. Why isn't raising the top tax rate part of this debate?
Because the other significant party in the whole mix is not actually pushing that envelope.
Right.
It's gone off that message since the last election, meaning the Labour Party has gone off pushing for more equity in the taxation, progressive taxation regime that the country has got. I think that's why it isn't there. It's like the government it's looking at its pressure points, and it's moved to a degree in some of those. Albeit using the opportunity for ideology to rule, like in the housing sector, etc., etc. But really, when it comes down to it, you know, those types of arguments, for the government to actually move on them and give some sort of position, policy position on them, it is really up to the opposition pack to demand answers in that respect. They are good in the House at the moment, the opposition bloc parties, but it's not filtering through to sowing this compelling argument of solution-based policies, and that's the challenge for the next year, really, for those leaders of those parties.
Wayne, the debt bogeyman is wheeled out consistently to justify austerity, but it is the private debt that's the problem, not the government debt, and that private debt is the direct legacy of user pays. Can debt reduction continue to be National's defence?
Look, debt's recycled throughout the economy and has been for the last decade or so. Everybody's in debt. You know, like your debt is sold to you when you go to the bank. They want to sell you debt, right? So actually moaning about debt levels when the financial system actually encourages you to go into debt whenever practicable seems to be just a tad hypocritical.
Yeah.
Look, I think one of the main problems with this budget politically is that Labor's position is quite weak and lacking a real opposition. They've said nothing about job creation really. They've had vague notions of growth, but they don't say where that growth is going to come from. And as Selwyn has pointed out, they haven't revisited the tax question, have they? This is the party which pioneered progressive taxation in order to provide a more evenness when austerity measures were required, and they've just not gone there, have they? So that means that it's going to give dear old Mr. English a free pass.
And he's certainly got it.
Question to both of you. What actual economic vision is the government expressing in today's budget? What do they believe? What can you look at this budget and go, that's what National believes?
Okay, in some ways, what I can see is that Bill English has shouldered the burden of this budget at this time, the first budget of the new term. He's been able to bat off to a degree some of the more extreme right-wing neoliberal ideologues that dominate the caucus in National. That is, you know, in my view, one of the more positive things of this budget,
that show
that the
that
excesses have not come through like we saw in 1991.
That in itself, does that suggest English has got more power in National than Joyce?
I think what we're seeing there, when it comes down to trying to actually position the government to sustain stability indicators for other outside external monitors, then English is their man.
Right.
When it comes down to the rhetorical positions taken that give them the opportunity as a government to develop policy, to develop the opportunity of ideological shift, then you can see where the power is, and that's in the neoliberal right. The thrashing of the beneficiaries in this country at the moment is an indication of that. I think too, what comes down to it, if we see in this budget, there is wins for that far right and National too. If we look here, I've just made a couple of notes. Tax loophole for those wealthy people with their batches and their yachts, etc. That will save the government around 109 million over 4 years. Okay. Now the tax credits cancelled for home child assistance, etc., etc., will save 117 million over those years. So while the government didn't even mention that this week, it mentioned, you know, we're going to put more equity in getting the rich to actually shoulder the burden. It doesn't stack up in the numbers. Actually, once again, those who need help to get it to afford to work are being caned.
What's the economic vision that the government are expressing here?
Well, wealth defence, although they won't tell you that. They think that the partial privatisations will provide them with a windfall for social and economic investment. I don't think that's true, and neither do a lot of other commentators, but they believe in that. And there's another important subtext here, and that's they're sort of relying on something to turn up in the oil and minerals sector to suddenly create all these jobs in Northland and off the East Coast where unemployment is highest. But these expectations, I don't think they're going to be matched by reality.
Are they magic beans? They're sort of selling us for the cow?
Well, there's also environmental difficulties as well.
And it's a long-term game.
If you invite a transnational to come in and do this, then the local beneficiaries of that are going to be National voters. So, I mean, to be charitable, I think National does want to create jobs. But it's not their top priority, and they don't seem to have a systematic plan for doing so.
And I think they believe that the market will develop those jobs if they create the conditions for the market to prosper. But even when you take their argument, the conditions aren't there. If you look at even the Manufacturers and Exporters Association's view, is that the opportunities are not there for them to do that. So even if you bought into that ideology,
So the conditions would suggest perhaps an active government is necessary for the economy, but they still believe in this hands-off, let the market do it.
They believe in hands-off when it comes to actually developing these opportunities, but they're very hands-on when they want to actually strangle local government. So it's a hard one to define in some ways.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with Focus 3. What are the political ramifications of today's zero budget? Selwyn, have National ridden the austerity horse as far as they can? This was originally sold, remember, as a zero budget with some pride, but then you had English doing a lot of backpedaling over the last couple of days, trying to not sell it as an austerity package. Have they taken austerity as far as they can? Have they perceived a change in the mood of the electorate?
Well, what I did pick up is there was a slight shift of disinvestment. This is rhetoric as opposed to reality.
This
right?
is just rhetoric.
A disinvestment mood was there in the housing sector for some time. What we saw here was the rhetoric shifting to investment type talk in the housing sector. But if you peel that away, and remember we've got to go into all the detail here, but the trends that they started setting 2 years ago showed that they wanted private and community operated trusts to move into the housing stock sector. Now today he's indicating, Bill English is indicating, that there's some sort of correlation investment with, they want to work with the housing investment sector with this huge amount, was it $15 billion of housing stock. Now that puts up signals to me that they're actually starting to calculate the value of its housing stock. And if we look at the 1990s and the market rents for state house tenants types moves, it's a formidable kind of beast that they're actually resurrecting here.
Wayne, who has stood out in the opposition in countering this budget?
Yeah, to look at the political ramifications, as I intimated earlier, you've really got to look at the Labor position. And I view Shearer as a creature of the Labor right. So, as I said, he's not addressing the tax issues, progressive taxation, right? There doesn't seem to be a systematic job creation program coming from Labor, as there is from the Greens, you know, investing in renewable energy and so on. So therefore, the real opposition coming from New Zealand First, the Mana Party and the Greens, that's quite separate from what Labor's doing. And Labor, in many respects, look to be closer to National than those other three parties.
Is that on purpose? They're trying to hold that middle ground, aren't they?
Yeah, they're just waiting for National voters to come over to their side as Key becomes more unpopular. It's a kind of it's a cynical, passive strategy. You know, don't frighten the horses. We'll be government eventually. So the political ramifications in terms of opposing all of this, therefore, I think they derive from popular opposition. I think the living wage campaign that the Service Food Workers Union have developed, the coalitions of opposition against partial privatisations, that's where the real grump's going to happen, because it's not coming from our major opposition party.
If you peel away inside the Labor Party, there's opportunity for the next wave of leadership to actually assert themselves. You can see that David Cunliffe, for example, has got much there to work with to actually roll out solution-based policies as he positions to actually convince the majority in caucus, the various factions, that he's their man. Maybe that political consequence of this budget is...
He's quite conservative as well on economics, but I'm just sort of hoping that if he had a finance portfolio or was the leader, that his position might shift slightly as he analysed what was happening.
Well, if they want to create jobs and get the unions on side with him to get him through.
So he has got the intellect to move a little further to the left. I'm not sure that Shearer has.
The surplus by 2014, 2015, is that a political goal or is that an economic goal, and is it actually achievable? Come on.
The first two, I think, are tied in tandem.
Right.
What it is there is it's an indication of the government has set itself a goal. It's a mark of achievement or a mark of failure. But once again, it's roped us all into that scrum to get there. So if it doesn't get there, it's going to be saying it's because these sectors here didn't perform outside of our expectations, to our expectations. I think, you know, as far as is it achievable, we've discussed here from a position of concern that there are so many variables domestically, let alone, like Wayne said, the thousands of variables globally. It is impossible to know if they get it. My gut instinct is that the fundamentals in the budget have not been addressed, and they are creating the opportunity to achieve these goals.
Yeah.
It's not there.
200 million surplus is chump change in a budget of, 75 billion. Are we going to get there in 2014, or is this just a fantasy?
Well, it's a fantasy, not because national are fantasists, but because the realities of the global economy are that there's too many variables to work with, especially when the global economy is so volatile, so financially volatile. So I guess the better approach is to look at a range of economic indicators and try and balance those rather than fixate on fiscal numbers when they are the product of a whole lot of other things that are happening in the global and the national economy.
Final question to you both: who wins, who loses politically from the budget?
New Zealand's whole population loses on this, except for the most wealthy.
Yep. Politically, who wins, who loses? Which parties?
The right wing of the Labour Party and National are the big winners out of this, and everybody else can just lose and eat that.
Let's wrap the show. Last word. Wayne, your final word this week is?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate something we've touched on earlier. The government claiming they want less and less people to migrate to Australia. They don't want they don't want a huge departure of skilled labour and professional people. But one particular thing in this budget has actually made that more likely rather than less, and that is the more onerous loan conditions once you go past 4 years. So if a student gets a bachelor's degree and maybe a 1 year's honours degree and gets reasonable loan support for that, then after that it becomes more expensive to do masters and especially to do PhDs. So are we encouraging our top PhD students to migrate from New Zealand and do them elsewhere? It just does not make sense.
So, on your final word this week is?
The final word is that, with the budget, quite often we will see the various portfolios on who is getting what and who isn't as an indication of what ministers are actually performing, who's on top of his or her game. If you look at the foreign affairs areas and the foreign affairs and trade areas, one would expect that this budget will succeed if you had our export markets actually working very, very well. There is nothing in those portfolios. For me, that indicates that one, Murray McCully from the foreign affairs aspects is not on his game. He is out of touch not only with his ministry and its highly appointed high commissioners and ambassadors, he's out of touch with his own government for making the biggest gains he possibly could for that portfolio in this budget. Likewise with Trade Minister Grosser. I mean, where is Grosser in this whole budget? He is non-existent.
Big calls, big calls. Thank you, Sal, and thank you, Wayne. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. 65 million over 4 years for desperately needed rehab is a smokescreen story so that the £10,000 albino private prison gorilla in the corrections budget won't be noticed. Why are we blowing 900 million on a new private prison when, after taking into account the current budgeted prison closures, there will still be 2,992 spare beds? Why build a new prison with just under 1,000 beds when we have almost 3,000 spare beds? Why are we building empty prisons when our schools and hospitals and dole queues are so full? How exactly will the 65 million reduce 600 prisoners by 2017 when the Justice Department last September was forecasting 487 fewer prisoners by then? So this additional 65 million will only reduce 113 prisoners when the 487 that were already predicted not to re-enter prison are taken into account. It's not just the $2 billion plus in tax cuts to the rich that is economic vandalism by the zero budget government. It's also the vast misuse of public funds for ideological masturbation. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.